My grandmother outsmarted two greedy pastors from beyond the grave. My grandmother spent most of her adult life as a member of a large conservative church in the Deep South. I'll call it Big White Church. It was part of a well-known evangelical denomination and sat in a wealthy suburb just outside a major city. You know the kind of place? Big steeple, even bigger parking lot, a gym in the basement, and a service schedule that ran like a train station. Grandma wasn't just another face in the pews. She worked in the nursery every single Sunday without fail. She helped cook church breakfasts, dinners, holiday meals, anything that brought people together. She'd go on choir tours, retreats, youth camps, and mission fundraisers. She taught Sunday night youth Bible study, helped organize home missions, and gave extra whenever the church needed it. If they passed the plate, she filled it. But it wasn't about being seen. Grandma's gift was making others feel important. I remember watching her in that church kitchen, cooking breakfast for 30 teenagers like it was nothing. Afterward, she'd clap for some student who had organized the breakfast, when really, all they did was remind her what time it started. That was who she was, always giving, always lifting others up, even when no one noticed what she'd done. There was one youth retreat I remember clearly. We were out at a rural camp, an hour from the city, when someone realized they'd left a whole box of evangelism materials back at the church. One of the assistant pastors, let's call him Ass Pastor, asked Grandma if she could go get it. She didn't complain. She drove through the night, brought the box back in time for the morning session, and never said a word about it. The senior pastor, who I'll call Pompous Pastor, never even knew there'd been a problem. Ass Pastor didn't thank her either. When I asked her why she went through all that trouble, she smiled and said, "Because those papers might help someone find Jesus." She meant it too. She gave that church her time, her energy, and a good portion of her life. And she did it all with a quiet kind of grace that you don't see much anymore. No expectations, no bitterness, no ego. Just love. Grandma's life at the church didn't slow down until her body forced it to. One afternoon, she was in a car accident. It wasn't anyone's fault. Just bad timing, bad luck. The crash broke her back, and after that, she never really recovered. She was 73 when it happened. That was the beginning of her final chapter, 10 years of being mostly homebound, managing pain, and watching the world carry on without her. She couldn't stand or walk for long, and the stairs at Big White Church were no longer an option. But her faith stayed the same. If anything, it got stronger. She kept her Bible close and stayed curious, always wanting to talk about scripture or the latest missions update. She tried to stay involved, just in different ways. She called the church office a few times, left messages. She sent cards and letters to friends in her Bible study group. She invited people over when she was feeling well enough to host, but no one ever came. Not once. In the beginning, she tried to explain it away. "They're probably busy," she'd say. "I don't want to be a burden." But after a while, even those excuses stopped coming. The silence from Big White Church became its own answer. It wasn't just the leadership who disappeared. It was everyone. The women she used to cook with, the kids she once taught, the friends she'd prayed beside for decades, all of them gone. The same people who once called her like a second mother didn't send a single birthday card or check-in. She didn't talk much about how it made her feel. She never asked anyone to feel sorry for her. But I saw the way her eyes lingered on the phone when it rang, or how she brightened just at the idea of company, only for the moment to pass. There was no official goodbye. Just a quiet drift into the margins, where no one from the church seemed to notice she was missing. Toward the end of her life, Grandma went into home hospice care. Her body had grown weaker, and she knew her time was limited. But her mind was still clear, and she wanted to put her affairs in order with the same quiet strength that she had lived her life. One of the last things she asked for was to plan her own funeral. She didn't want it to be complicated, just a service at Big White Church, the place she had given so much of herself to. She and Grandpa called the church to speak with the senior pastor, the one she had known for over 30 years. He didn't return the call. A few days later, the assistant pastor, ass pastor, showed up instead. I wasn't there for that conversation, but Grandpa told me what happened. They talked about the funeral for a few minutes, the basics. But then ass pastor shifted the subject. He started asking Grandma if she had considered laying up treasure in heaven by remembering the church in her will. Grandpa stepped in. He told him firmly it wasn't the time for that kind of discussion. Grandma was in pain. She could barely sit up. Still, ass pastor circled back again and again to the money. He quoted scripture about where your treasure is. He talked about the church's financial needs. He framed it as an opportunity to bless others. Grandpa told him more than once to stop. But he wouldn't let it go. And that's when Grandma cried. Not politely, not a single tear. She broke down completely. My grandmother, who had never cried when the doctor told her she'd never walk again, who didn't cry through months of physical therapy or even while planning her own funeral, was sobbing. This wasn't a woman who cried for herself. She wept with others, sure, at funerals or hospital bedsides. She believed in comforting people who were hurting. But this time, the pain was her own, and it finally spilled out. Grandpa didn't say much after that. He stood up, walked across the room, and physically removed ass pastor from the house. It wasn't dramatic or loud, it was final. Despite what the doctors had said, Grandma held on for another 6 months. None of us were surprised. She had always done things on her terms. Her strength wasn't loud or showy, it just ran deep. Even in those final months, she stayed as present as she could. She wrote letters. She gave away small keepsakes to people she loved. She talked to Grandpa about how she wanted to be remembered. When the time finally came, we didn't hold her funeral at Big White Church. That decision had already been made. Grandpa said the pastors weren't welcome, and we didn't argue. The service was held at a local funeral home instead. It was modest, just like she would have wanted. Pompous pastor didn't come. Neither did ass pastor. In fact, not a single person from Big White Church showed up, not even as part of the audience. But the room wasn't empty. There were close to 100 people there. Neighbors, old friends, family from every corner of the state. People Grandma had helped over the years. Some we hadn't seen in ages. Many of them shared stories, funny, heartfelt, sometimes unexpected. 3 of the grandchildren played her favorite hymns on guitar and piano. There were tears, but also laughter. It felt honest. At the start of the service, Grandpa stood at the podium. He said simply, "Some of you may have heard that I disinvited pompous pastor and ass pastor from this funeral. This service isn't the place to explain why, though I think most of you know me well enough to trust my reasons. Also, my wife asked me to exclude them." Then he told everyone it would be an open mic service. Anyone who wanted to speak could come forward, share a memory, tell a story, say goodbye in their own way. He said it didn't have to be polished or rehearsed, just honest. People lined up. We had planned for a short memorial, maybe half an hour, but it stretched well past 2 hours, and no one left early. Not one person. People cried, hugged, held hands. Some of us sang together. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a community, like what church is supposed to be. And by the end, a few people said out loud what many of us were already thinking: funerals are better without preachers anyway. A few weeks after the funeral, it was time to go over Grandma's will. Technically, there was no reason to have a formal reading. These days, everything can be handled by mail or email. But in our family, it was tradition. The will reading was one of those rare excuses for everyone to gather in one place. We didn't do family reunions, but we showed up for birthdays, funerals, baptisms, and wills. It wasn't about the inheritance. It was about presence. We met at a law office. The conference room was small, probably not meant to hold that many people. Extra chairs had been brought in, and there were folks standing along the walls. My mom was there, along with aunts, uncles, cousins, great-aunts, and uncles, all packed in tightly, talking quietly and catching up while we waited for things to start. That's when pompous pastor and ass pastor walked in. None of us had invited them, but they explained that Grandma's lawyer had notified them. Apparently, the will included bequests to Big White Church and to them personally. Maybe they expected gratitude. Maybe they thought their absence at the funeral had gone unnoticed. If they felt awkward walking into that room, they didn't show it. The lawyer, who also happened to be one of Grandma's sons, my uncle, greeted them politely and offered them seats near the front, right next to him. Because of how the room was arranged, they were now seated directly across from everyone else, with no easy way out. The only door was behind almost 24 family members. We watched them settle in. They smiled, nodded at a few people. We nodded back, but no one said much. There was a kind of tension in the air, not hostile, just expectant. Like we all knew something was coming. We just didn't know what yet. The reading began. As expected, Grandpa was listed as the first beneficiary. He received the house, their retirement savings, and whatever remained after the other bequests had been distributed. Then came the smaller items: keepsakes, letters, old family jewelry. Each of the grandchildren received a modest amount of money. So did her children, nieces, nephews, and a few local charities. It was generous, thoughtful, and exactly the kind of will you'd expect from someone like Grandma. Organized, fair, personal. And as the list went on, it became clear that the most valuable bequests were coming last. The pastors sat quietly, but we could feel their anticipation building. They had noticed the pattern just like we had. The gifts were increasing in value as the list went on. Eventually, the lawyer reached their names. But before he read the amounts, he paused, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and said, "Before I continue, my mother asked me to read a statement she wrote by hand. She wanted everyone present to hear it." The room quieted as soon as my uncle said those words. He unfolded the handwritten letter slowly, almost ceremonially, and began to read. It was unmistakably Grandma's handwriting, neat, careful, a little slanted to the right. She didn't start with anger. She started with honesty. "For the past 10 years," she wrote, "not one person from Big White Church has called me, visited me, or sent a note to let me know I was remembered. Not a pastor, not a deacon, not one woman from the kitchen, or any of the church members I once considered friends." She went on to name all the things she had done: Sunday school, youth retreats, mission support, breakfasts cooked, holidays served, and how she had done them with joy. But what hurt, she said, wasn't being unable to serve anymore. It was being forgotten. She had reached out again and again and gotten nothing in return. "I made one final attempt," she wrote. "When I was dying, I asked Pompous Pastor to come visit and help plan my funeral. He never came. Ass Pastor did, but he didn't want to talk about the funeral. He only wanted to talk about the church's financial needs, about my will." There was a pause in the room, just the sound of quiet breathing. You could feel everyone processing what they were hearing, not just the content, but the tone. She wasn't trying to shame anyone. She was just telling the truth. "My will at that time," she wrote, "already included a double tithe, 20% of my entire estate, for the church. It was meant as my final offering." Then came the turn. "But after that visit," she said, "I got to thinking. I felt bad that I hadn't included the pastors personally, so I revised the will to add both Pompous Pastor and Ass Pastor by name. And while I was at it, I decided to adjust the church's portion to match the love and care they showed me in the last 10 years. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. When the letter ended, the silence in the room was complete. My uncle folded the paper, looked around, and continued reading the will. "Bequest to Ass Pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to Pompous Pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to Big White Church, 1 cent. The two men sat frozen. They didn't look angry, not yet. Just stunned, like someone had cut the power to the room and they hadn't figured out how to blink. No one else moved either. It wasn't out of cruelty. It was out of respect. We all knew Grandma. We knew she wasn't done. No one laughed, not out loud. But you could feel the reaction ripple through the room like a low hum. Some of us exchanged glances, others looked down at their laps to hide smiles. Not because it was funny exactly, but because it was so completely her. That 1 cent wasn't meant to embarrass anyone. It wasn't a joke. It was her way of drawing a line. For someone who had spent her life giving without ever asking for anything in return, it was a rare moment of saying, "I noticed how I was treated, and I'm not pretending I didn't. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple, quiet, and final." Pompous. Pastor and ass pastor didn't say anything. Their posture had shifted. The self-assured air they'd carried into the room was gone. You could tell they were calculating how fast they could get out of there without making a scene. But their seats were boxed in, family on all sides, no graceful exit. And still, the will wasn't done. My uncle cleared his throat as if to signal that there was one more item left to address. "There is one final bequest," he said, "to a charity called..." And he gave the name. We didn't recognize it right away, but the look on the pastors' faces told us everything. They knew exactly who the charity was. The charity, which I'll call Black Charity, was run by a black church just a few miles from Big White Church. Years ago, there had been some kind of falling out between the two. Officially, it was about theology. Big White Church claimed Black Charity focused too much on social gospel programs like food banks, clothing drives, and housing support. But anyone who grew up in the area, especially in the Deep South, knew what it was really about. The partnership ended abruptly and bitterly. Big White Church even filed a lawsuit to try to get their donations back. It didn't go anywhere, but the message was clear. Those ties were cut, and they weren't coming back. Grandma had stayed quiet during all that. She and Grandpa talked about leaving the church, but ultimately they decided to stay. "My church is my mission field," she used to say. I don't think I understood what she meant until that day in the conference room. What we didn't know, not until that will was read, was that Grandma and Grandpa had quietly supported Black Charity for years. A portion of their monthly tithe had gone to it, without fanfare or recognition. It wasn't a statement. It was just what they believed was right. When my uncle announced the amount of the final bequest, it was the same figure Grandma had originally intended to give to Big White Church, 20% of her entire estate. No one clapped. No one spoke. We just sat there, watching the two pastors as the full weight of what had just happened settled in. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't about punishment. It was clarity. She had chosen where her final act of generosity would go, not to the institution that forgot her, or to the leaders who treated her like a checkbook on her deathbed, but to a group doing the quiet work she believed in. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just love. When everything was said and done, there wasn't much left to talk about. The lawyers wrapped up the meeting, people stood and stretched, and we slowly filed out into the hallway. The pastors left without saying a word. No one stopped them. Grandma never wanted attention. She didn't write that letter to stir up drama or humiliate anyone. She just wanted the truth to be known, plainly and without decoration. That she loved deeply, gave freely, and hurt quietly. She didn't shout, she didn't accuse, and she didn't ask anyone to choose sides. She simply wrote down what had happened and let her final choices speak for themselves. And when I think back on her life, on the breakfasts cooked, the youth camps, the letters never answered, and the tears she rarely allowed herself, I don't remember the silence from the church. I remember the room full of people singing. I remember her will, not just as a legal document, but as a final act of kindness and conviction. And I remember thinking, she never stopped giving. She just started giving to the people who gave back.